Don't laugh at the farm girl with bare feet. Wait, she hears what steel forgets. They laughed at the barefoot girl, but she whispered, "It's breathing wrong." Noonlight poured into the county hall, filtered through dusty panes, cutting into long, sharp beams. Clara June Whitfield pressed herself against the mottled brick wall, her bare toes gripping the cracks in the concrete floor like a bird clutching its branch in the wind. On the stage stood men in neat Meridian Institute suits, their voices rolling with promises of the future. Before them stretched a carbon fiber bridge, its body dark and smooth as fish scale, a bow-shaped span promising strength without weight, beauty without compromise. Their words dripped with equations. Lighter than steel, stronger than storms, optimized by AI. Clara did not understand all of it. But she listened. In the whirring of the ceiling fan, in the soft hiss of the projector, in the scrape of wooden chairs, there was another rhythm, faint as a needle brushing skin. The bridge, even as a model, was breathing unevenly. Its inhale was not equal to its exhale. Her eyes, brown as wet clay, fixed on the left support, where a small, transparent base clutched the span. When the host invited questions, calloused men from the fields stayed silent. Only Clara spoke, voice low enough for shame. "The bridge will lean left." Heads turned. A young engineer with a red tie grinned, round as a button. "And how do you know that, little one?" Clara said nothing. She kept her gaze on the transparent support. The laughter grew, easy and dismissive, until an older man, jaw squared like a steel line, tilted his head. Dr. Nathaniel Kerrigan of MIT, the closing guest, was not smiling. His eyes, sharp and wary, cut through the room. "And you say, lean left? Because?" Kerrigan's voice was dry, deliberate, each word like a measured footstep on old stone stairs. Clara swallowed. "It breathes uneven," she said. "The left side breathes slower." Another wave of laughter burst. The host chuckled, explaining with authority, "This model has been optimized by FEM, finite element method, and a reinforcement learning AI. Boundary conditions are symmetrical. There is no lean left or right." Clara didn't know FEM or reinforcement learning, but she knew breath. Her father had once sat her on beams at the farm and said, "Listen to what the wind tells the roof." She had listened, and the roof had swelled like a chest. Before the hammer struck, her father once stopped, whispering, "This post coughs. Don't force it." They didn't listen. The beams split. Splinters flew. Weeks later, her father was gone. Another accident on another site. Since then, every structure Clara touched carried lungs. Kerrigan stepped closer to the model, tapping its ends. His finger pressed the left support. The bridge quivered faintly. A vibration twisted, hoarse. He bent low, ear to the span, like a luthier listening to a gut string still tightening. "Can we bring up the modal frequencies?" he asked. The projector lit with curving lines of red and blue. "Here's the modal analysis," the engineer said briskly. "Fundamental frequency around 5.6 Hz. Formula checked. 2 equals K, MU 2 18 kmm. Symmetrical. No drift." Kerrigan narrowed his eyes. "Any coupling between torsion and bending?" "Second mode?" "Negligible," came the answer. "We used carbon laminates at 090 and plus 45. The anisotropic stiffness matrix K is stable." Clara pointed at the base again. "The rubber pad under that one is thinner." The room laughed louder. "She sees through plastic, does she?" But the young engineer bent low. Beneath the transparent support, a thin rubber square sagged, one edge shaved by heat or time. He flushed. "It's insignificant. tolerances. Kerrigan's voice sliced. Sometimes a small softness drags torsion ahead of bending. In plain words, a bridge doesn't just bounce up and down, it twists. If the left is weaker, the twist leans left. Under crosswind, it breathes poorly. He turned back to Clara. You listen with your ears? With the ground, she said simply, toes gripping harder. This side hums different than that side. Silence fell. The host coughed, then briskly steered back. Anyway, this is only a demonstration. Out on site, everything is standardized. Thank you all. Images of gleaming cables and silver decks filled the screen again. Clara shrank into shadow. She should not have spoken. Her patched dress, her kitchen scissor haircut, her roots-deep feet, they marked her as out of place. Her mother always said, silence hurts less. But silence could not silence the crooked breath. It only made it louder inside. As the crowd poured out like a tide, Kerrigan stood on the hall steps, watching the sun fall along the corrugated roof. He saw the girl walk across dead grass, bare feet sinking, her body bent as if listening for something in the wind. He nearly called out, but didn't. A colleague appeared, reminding him of his flight. He nodded, but his mind turned elsewhere. Later, in a dim motel, the ceiling fan still wheezed its old refrain. Kerrigan reopened the model, not because he believed her, he believed only in numbers, but because he despised cheap laughter, and because the way her toes clutched the ground was, strangely, more convincing than accelerometers. He reset the boundary conditions, a softer left support, uneven crosswind, rainfall waiting. The curves on the screen wavered. In the second mode, torsion slipped in. He pushed the wind speed higher. 2 modes, bending and twisting, tangled. A coupling, small but real. The bridge leaned, a reluctant bow to the left. Kerrigan sat upright. Lateral torsional buckling? He scribbled, hand firm. M-E-E-I-M-E-I-E. If stiffness, I slipped even a hair. The left absorbed too much. The AI's symmetry had blinded it. Machines did not know that one side of Earth dries slower after rain. He ran another variant, a lamina misaligned by 2 degrees. Flutter. Not collapse, but a sick cough across the span, enough to shake the stomach of anyone crossing. The screen's curves jittered like lungs, choking on uneven breath. Kerrigan closed his eyes. For years he had trusted equations alone. Yet here he was, repeating in his own whisper the child's strange phrase, "It breathes wrong." When the engineers emailed, "Field test tomorrow at 9," he typed a polite reply. Then, alone in the amber light, he wrote in his notebook, "How can a child with no symbols see what the model cannot?" He paused, then, for the first time in years, wrote a line without proof. Because she listened. Before we spoke. Outside, Arkansas night stretched dry and long. Clara trudged home across cracked red earth. She regretted her words. Speaking drew stares, and stares weighed heavier than hunger. Passing a neighbor's wall, she pressed her palm to the brick. A tremor ran into her bones. Nothing but the wind, yet it was enough. Silence had its rhythm, too. Silence told the truth. At home, her mother lay curled, back wrapped in cloth. Clara boiled water. Steam gathered, round then gone, like the curves on those screens dissolving into air. She laid her hand on her mother's spine, feeling the ache contract and ease. "Mama," she whispered, not to wake, but to lay a pebble in the dark water. "I think I dropped a sentence today." And so the night held them both. The old professor restless in his motel, the barefoot girl curled in her crumbling house. Somewhere between them, In that hush, only the forgotten hear. A bridge breathed. And for the first time, Kerrigan felt humble before a pair of bare feet. The roof leaked again. Water had dried in thin stains down the wall, leaving brown rivulets like the veins of an old leaf. Clara June Whitfield pushed a bucket under the newest drip, though she knew by morning the water would shift, escaping to another crack. Her mother lay on the cot, wrapped in an old quilt, back stiff with pain that never seemed to sleep. Clara sat beside her, breaking the stale crust of bread she had saved from the day before. The bread was hard, sharp at the edges, but she chewed carefully, letting it soften on her tongue. The room was small, its walls patched with cardboard, its floor rough clay mottled by rain. Yet the earth was hers. She pressed her fingers into the damp soil near the door, tracing circles, then spirals. First tight, then widening. Her fingernails blackened with dust. Her palm left trails like a map. She did not plan the shapes. They came like breathing, curves expanding, then falling inward again. Outside, cicadas scraped their endless song. Inside, Clara's spirals multiplied. One from the breadcrumbs that rolled when the floor dipped, another from the way rain had carved around a stone by the threshold. She connected them all, like a secret alphabet only the earth understood. By lantern light, her drawings glistened faintly. Chalk-white lines, smudged from old plaster, mixed with charcoal she had stolen from the firewood. She drew until the floor was a galaxy of whorls. Unknowingly, Clara was sketching the same distribution engineers call spiral load paths, the way force diffuses across matter, spreading outward in curves rather than lines. A column rarely carried weight in a neat vertical. It wound through, spiraling down into soil, dissipating tension like ripples on a pond. Clara had never heard the words. She simply felt them. A quiet knock tapped against the door. She startled, hand sweeping across the earth to smudge her drawings. The door creaked, and in stepped Mr. Browder. He was not young nor old. The years of chalk dust on his jackets had bleached him in a pale, ghostly way. For decades, he had taught arithmetic to farm children. Sums, fractions, the slow patience of multiplication tables. He had once taught Clara before her mother's back gave out and Clara left school to work odd jobs. He had not come to collect her. Teachers in towns like this could not afford to chase the lost. But word had traveled after the county hall incident. He had heard of a barefoot girl standing before engineers, whispering about a bridge that breathed. He wanted to see for himself. His eyes fell to the clay floor, and he froze. Everywhere, spirals. Perfect arcs nested within one another. Tight curls blooming outward into wide curves, none of them clumsy. They carried rhythm, not chaos. He stepped closer, then knelt, the old boards of his knees cracking. He touched one spiral with the tip of his finger, careful not to ruin its curve. "Child," his voice faltered. "Do you know what you've drawn?" Clara shrank against the wall. "Just circles. Not circles. Spirals. Do you know the difference?" She shook her head. "Circles close on themselves. Spirals keep breathing outward. They carry weight without breaking." He looked at her, his throat working against words too large. "This one here, it corrects the weakness in a beam. And this curve, it's the way an arch distributes rain when it falls uneven." Clara blinked, silent. He stood, his shoes leaving dusty prints among the spirals. For the first time in years, Mr. Browder felt the ache of awe. It was one thing to teach children the safe tricks of fractions. It was another to watch a child, unschooled, discover the bones of the world by touch. He turned to Clara, voice softer. "You saw that bridge today, didn't you?" "The one from the Institute." Her lips tightened. She remembered the laughter, the red tie, the humiliation pressing like a stone in her chest. "They mocked you," Browder said. "But you were right, weren't you?" She said nothing. She dug her toe into the dirt, curling it like the center of another spiral. He sighed. Genius wears many masks. Sometimes chalk, sometimes clay, sometimes just silence. He bent to pick up a small piece of charcoal from the corner. "May I?" She nodded. On the far side of the floor, he drew a simple line, straight as he could manage. "This is how the textbooks say weight travels. Down, clean, predictable." He pressed harder, making the line darker. "But buildings don't live in textbooks. They live in storms, in soil that shifts, in wood that coughs before it cracks." He tapped her spirals. This is truth. The earth likes to turn. It hates to march straight." Clara stared, then asked the smallest of questions. "Why?" Browder swallowed. His mind rushed with matrices, with the language of engineers, with formulas he had not used since his own unfinished college days. He wanted to explain stress tensors, anisotropy, the way force flows like water. But looking at her, small shoulders, cracked heels, eyes waiting, he said only, "Because the world doesn't fall in lines. It falls in circles, so it can rise again." For a long time they stood together, teacher and child, among spirals drawn on clay. Outside, the wind carried the smell of river mud, even though the river was 20 miles away. It smelled like something old, something that had been traveling long before men built bridges or wrote formulas. Browder lifted his gaze at last. "I'll tell you something, Clara June. Those men in suits may know symbols, but you know breath, and sometimes breath is wiser than symbols." He stepped toward the door. "Guard these spirals. They are your inheritance. They'll try to scrape them away. Don't let them." Clara watched him go, lantern light tracing his frame into shadow. Then she knelt again, fingertip returning to the clay. Her spirals widened, crossing his straight line until the line itself seemed to bend, captured in the turning. The bucket under the leak filled, drop by drop. Each ripple spread outward, another spiral written by water. Clara smiled faintly, though her lips trembled. She had not eaten enough. Her belly was hollow, but the spirals filled it in another way. As she drifted toward sleep beside her mother, the spirals seemed to lift from the floor and hover in her dreams, spinning like galaxies, like seeds, like a bridge that could breathe without breaking. And in another town, far away, Dr. Kerrigan sat at his desk, sleepless, the memory of a barefoot girl gnawing at his pride. He did not yet know her name, but in his notebook, beside cold formulas, he wrote one line. "There is a geometry older than us, and she has already found it." The morning was gray, heavy with the smell of wet earth. Clara was outside, crouched by the patch of clay near the porch, tracing spirals with a piece of charred wood. The patterns spread wider than the doorway now, some tight, some loose, all flowing into one another as if the ground itself exhaled through her hand. Her mother slept inside, breathing shallow against the quilt. Clara worked quietly, bare toes gripping the mud, her hand moving without pause. Each stroke was instinct. A coil here to catch the tension of the leaning wall, another curve to release weight from the sagging roof beam. She didn't know these terms. She only knew that the shapes felt right, like soothing a wound with her palm. The crunch of tires startled her. Few cars came this far down the rutted road. She lifted her head and froze. A dark sedan pulled up, its paint dulled by travel dust. Out stepped Dr. Nathaniel Kerrigan, sharp-shouldered, tall despite his years, gray hair combed with precision. His polished shoes sank awkwardly into the clay, unfit for Arkansas soil. Clara's first instinct was to erase the drawings, to sweep her arm across the ground. But the spirals were too many, too deep. They stared up at the professor like eyes. Kerrigan stopped a few feet away. He looked not at Clara, but at the earth, at the spirals. His breath caught. He had spent nights since the county hall running simulations, wrestling with the numbers she had unsettled. But no equation had prepared him for this. A barefoot child bending over mud, drawing what his graduate students struggled to approximate with tensor calculus. For a long moment he said nothing. The air between them thickened with cicada song and silence. Clara lowered her eyes. "I didn't mean to make trouble that day." Kerrigan's voice was softer than before, yet carried its steel. "You weren't trouble. You were correction." She frowned, not understanding. He gestured to the spirals. "Do you know what you've drawn here?" She shook her head. "Just listening." "To what?" Her answer was almost a whisper. "The ground. The way it carries weight." Kerrigan crouched, careful not to ruin the lines. His fingers hovered just above a spiral, tracing its widening arcs. He could almost map it into the stiffness matrix of a curved beam. In academic terms, it was a natural solution to load diffusion. In hers, it was breath. "You don't know the words," he murmured. "Yet you see the form." Clara tensed. "Please don't laugh." He looked at her then. Truly looked. The child's shoulders were narrow, her dress threadbare. Her eyes, however, carried a gravity he had seen only in storm clouds above bridges, the kind of gravity that warned of collapse and demanded respect. "I'm not laughing," he said. "I came to listen." For the first time, Clara dared meet his gaze. She saw lines of fatigue etched into his face. But behind them something unexpected. Uncertainty. A man who had spent his life mastering steel, now humbled by mud. Kerrigan stood, brushing dust from his trousers. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then dialed. "It's Kerrigan," he said briskly into the receiver. "Cancel the field trial on the carbon bridge. Yes, cancel. I'll explain later." Clara blinked. "You stopped them?" "Yes," he said simply. "Because of me?" He inhaled slowly, watching the spirals again. "Because of you." The words hung in the damp air. Clara felt her chest tighten. All her life she had been invisible. A shadow at the market, a whisper in the classroom, a child no one expected anything of. Now this man, this voice from the world of steel and glass towers, had tied her to a decision larger than herself. She hugged her knees, suddenly afraid. "I don't know your numbers. I don't know your books." Kerrigan's reply was almost tender. "Sometimes books forget what dirt remembers." She tilted her head, not sure if it was kindness or rebuke. He walked a slow circle around her spirals, hands clasped behind his back. "Do you understand what would have happened if we'd built that bridge wrong?" Clara shook her head. "It could have swayed, twisted under wind, maybe not collapse, but imagine a child walking across. The bridge begins to hum beneath her, a rhythm out of balance. She panics. She runs. Panic spreads. And steel remembers panic longer than it remembers formulas." Clara bit her lip. She thought of her father, the beam that coughed before it split. She whispered, "People could die." "Yes," Kerrigan said. "People could die." Silence again. A bird darted from the fence post, winging low across the field. Finally, Clara asked, "Why did you come here?" Kerrigan paused. He had asked himself the same question all morning. He could have dismissed the girl, chalked it up to coincidence, buried it under data. but something in her voice at the hall had unsettled him deeper than equations. "Because I needed to see how you listen," he admitted. Clara tilted her head, confused. "You don't calculate," he said. "You hear. Structures breathe to you. To us, they are numbers. To you, they are lungs." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She didn't know if it was shame or pride. Kerrigan straightened, dusting his hands. "I don't know yet what to do with this. But I know one thing. You saved us from a mistake." Her voice trembled. "Then, I'm not trouble?" He shook his head. "No, Clara. You are proof." The cicadas droned louder, as if the earth itself had joined the conversation. Kerrigan took one last look at the spirals, then turned toward his car. He had conferences waiting, colleagues who would scoff at the idea of a barefoot farm girl correcting their models. Yet as he reached for the door handle, he felt the weight of responsibility. Knowledge once seen could not be unseen. Clara watched him go, her heart tangled. Part of her wanted him gone, to leave her in silence. Part of her wished he would stay, to name the shapes she could only feel. When the car disappeared down the road, she knelt again to the clay. Her finger found the center of the largest spiral, pressing until the earth indented. "Not trouble," she whispered to herself. "Proof." Inside, her mother stirred, coughing against the quilt. Clara rose, brushing clay from her palms. She would fetch water soon, tend to the pain, break what bread remained. But for now, the spirals glowed in her mind, glowing not with shame, but with the strange fire of being seen. And miles away, Dr. Kerrigan sat at the wheel of his sedan, staring at the empty road. He had just canceled a multi-million-dollar trial because of a child's whisper. He should feel foolish. Instead, he felt something rare, humbled. He wrote a note on the back of a receipt, his hand unsteady. "Some knowledge arrives barefoot. We must not step on it." The train shook gently as it rolled across the Mississippi plains. Clara sat by the window, her bare feet tucked under the hem of her patched dress, watching the landscape blur into long strokes of brown and green. She had never left Arkansas before. Now she was being carried eastward toward something called a conference. Mr. Browder had pressed her hand before she left. "Don't be afraid if they don't listen," he whispered. "Listening is not their habit. It is yours. That's why you matter." Dr. Kerrigan had arranged it all, though Clara barely understood his reasons. "You'll only observe," he told her. "A seat in the back. Nothing more." The Mississippi Technical Colloquium was held in a lecture hall large enough to swallow her entire town. Its ceilings arched high, studded with lamps that glowed like frozen stars. Rows of scholars in dark suits and professors with lined faces filled the seats, their voices buzzing in complicated phrases: modal coupling, parametric instability, nonlinear dynamics. Clara sat in the back, small and unnoticed, her hands folded tight in her lap. On the stage, a man strode forward, tall, self-assured, a polished smile. His name was Dr. Victor Lang, a rising figure in structural engineering, known for his quick tongue and sharper ambition. He carried a stack of papers, and behind him, the projector flashed diagrams. Spirals. Chalk-like spirals. Clara's breath caught. The curves on the screen were hers. The spirals she had drawn into Arkansas clay. The patterns that had come not from books, but from listening to ground and wind. There they were, copied clean, labeled with equations she could not read. Her stomach clenched. She pressed her toes harder into the floor as if trying to root herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Lang began, What you see here is a novel visualization of load distribution in anisotropic composites. A breakthrough, if I may be bold. We call it the spiral load mapping principle, derived through careful study and simulation. Applause rippled across the hall. Clara's heart hammered. She wanted to speak, to rise, to shout, but her throat tightened, as if a hand had closed around it. She was a child, nameless, barefoot. Who would believe her? From the front row, Kerrigan's eyes flicked to her. He had seen the spirals in her yard. He knew. Yet he did not rise. His jaw was clenched, but his hands were folded. Lang continued, his voice rolling smooth as polished wood. These patterns suggest a fundamental rethinking of damping matrices. If we interpret them correctly, we may even prevent catastrophic coupling under wind stress, the very phenomenon overlooked in current AI models. The applause swelled again. Clara's palms sweated. Each clap was a hammer driving her spirals deeper into someone else's name. She bit her lip until it bled. Then, a chair scraped. A woman rose from the third row, silver hair, stern eyes behind narrow glasses. Professor Margaret Whitaker, known for her uncompromising standards. "Dr. Lang," she said, her voice cutting the air, "your spirals are unusual. They lack mathematical derivation in your slides. Would you care to show the equations from which they arise?" Lang faltered for the first time. Well, the intuition behind them is—" "Intuition," Whitaker interrupted, "is not a citation." Her gaze swept the hall. Then, to Clara's shock, it landed on her, the small figure hunched in the back row. "Miss," Professor Whitaker said, pointing. "You there. Stand up." Clara froze. 100 heads turned. Heat flooded her face. Whitaker's voice was calm but firm. "You've been sketching spirals on your notepad since this lecture began. Would you care to come forward and clarify?" Clara's throat closed. She looked at Kerrigan, desperate. But his eyes told her nothing. He only nodded once, slowly, as though handing her a weight too heavy to carry. Her legs shook as she rose. Each step down the aisle felt like walking across a bridge above water. The scholars stared. Some smirked. Some frowned. She reached the stage, trembling. A piece of chalk was pressed into her hand. The blackboard loomed tall, clean, terrifying. Clara closed her eyes. She thought of her father's beam coughing before it split. She thought of her mother's shallow breath. She thought of the clay floor in their shack, still holding spirals that no one applauded. She pressed chalk to slate. The first line curved outward, a spiral unfurling. Her hand steadied with each turn. She spoke, voice shaking at first, then growing firmer. "This is not from books. It is from roofs, from fences, from soil after rain. A straight beam sags when heavy, but a spiral shares the weight. The earth prefers to turn, not to fall in lines." The hall fell quiet. She drew another spiral, smaller inside the first. When the wind comes, structures don't move only up and down. They twist. You can't see it with numbers at first, but if you listen— She paused, touching her ear. "If you listen, the twist is already there." Her chalk tapped softly. "I don't know your words, but if I stop drawing spirals, I stop thinking." The silence was heavy, reverent. 1,000 breaths held at once. Professor Whitaker leaned forward, her eyes narrowing not with doubt, but with something sharper— recognition. Dr. Lang cleared his throat, fumbling. This is anecdote, not proof." But the hall was not listening to him anymore. They were watching the barefoot girl whose spirals breathed across the blackboard like galaxies. Clara stepped back, chalk dust on her fingers, chest heaving. She wished only to vanish, to slip through the floor. But when she glanced toward the back, she saw Mr. Kerrigan, not smiling, not frowning, but watching her with the grave respect one gives to a storm. For the first time, Clara felt something anchor inside her, the fragile, terrifying possibility that her spirals belonged not just to mud and silence, but to the world. The chalk trembled in her hand. Clara June Whitfield stood before the great blackboard of Mississippi Tech, a wall of slate higher than the barn doors back home. Behind her, a sea of professors and engineers leaned forward in silence. Before her, the dark emptiness of the board stretched like a night sky, waiting for constellations. Her bare toes pressed into the polished floor. She thought of the clay back home, how it yielded under her feet, how it carried every weight into spirals. Here, the floor was cold, unyielding. Yet her hand remembered. She touched chalk to slate. A spiral unfurled, slow, shaky at first, then steadier. White dust clung to her fingers, a powder finer than the Arkansas dirt. Another spiral, inside the first, then another, until the board breathed with widening curves. She turned, voice soft but clear. "This is how the ground speaks." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Clara swallowed. Words did not come easily. She had no formulas to summon, no citations to shield her. She only had memory. "When I was little," she began, "our chicken coop would shake when the wind came. Not all at once. The boards rattled in a circle. If you stood still, you could feel the roof sway like it was breathing." She drew another spiral, smaller, off to the side. "The same with our fence. When rain fell heavy on one end, the weight didn't just drop. It curved like a rope sagging in arcs. It always wanted to spread, never to fall straight." The audience leaned in. Some frowned at the simplicity. Others scribbled notes as if hearing something half forgotten. Clara raised the chalk again. Her hand no longer trembled. She drew a long line, straight, uncompromising, across the board. It cut through the spirals. "This," she said, "is how books tell weight to move. Down, neat, in order." She tapped the line. "But roofs don't read books. Soil doesn't care for lines. The world prefers to turn." She stepped back, looking at the board, then at the hall. "You call it load distribution. I call it breathing. If you stop the turn, you stop the breath. And if you stop the breath—" Her voice faltered, memory rushing in. Her father coughing before the beam split, her mother's shallow breaths at night. She pressed on. "If you stop the breath, the structure dies." The words settled heavy in the room. A professor coughed, not in derision but as if clearing space in his chest. Another leaned forward, eyes glistening, his pen frozen mid-air. Clara gripped the chalk tighter. "I don't know your formulas, but I know this. If I stop drawing spirals, I stop thinking." The sentence hung like incense. For a moment, the hall was utterly still. No whispers, no shifting chairs, only the hush of people realizing they were listening with something deeper than ears. Clara lowered the chalk. White dust smeared her fingertips, a fragile crown. She wanted to step away, to disappear into the shadows again, but the silence urged her to continue. She drew yet another spiral, but this one she left unfinished, the line broken, opening outward. Some shapes close. They trap, but spirals, they don't end. They breathe out. They leave room for tomorrow. Professor Whitaker, who had called her forward, rose slowly from her seat. Her stern eyes softened just slightly. "Miss Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying, "may I ask, do you feel these spirals before you draw them?" Clara nodded, uncertain. "I hear them, not with my ears, with the ground. With the air when it shifts. Sometimes, even with silence." Gasps and murmurs stirred. An older engineer whispered to the man beside him, "She's describing modal resonance without knowing the term." Another scribbled furiously, "Torsional coupling visualized by instinct." Dr. Lang, still seated at the edge of the stage, tried to interject. "This is anecdotal, poetic. Without derivation, it is meaningless." But the words rang hollow. The room was no longer his. Clara stepped back from the board, dust falling from her hands. She felt small again, suddenly aware of her bare feet, her patched dress, the gulf between her and the scholars. Yet in the silence, she sensed something shift. Not applause, not cheers, something deeper. Respect. For the first time, she did not feel invisible. Kerrigan rose in the back row. He did not clap. He did not smile, but he bowed his head, just once, a gesture of acknowledgement, almost reverence. And Clara, heart pounding, whispered to herself the truth she had carried since the day of the bridge. Not trouble. Proof. The air in Cambridge was heavy with salt from the ocean, and with the restless hum of a city that never slept. MIT's campus was larger than Clara had ever imagined. Tall glass buildings, long halls lined with steel, and stairways echoing with the hurried steps of students who always carried books or glowing screens in their arms. Clara walked through it all barefoot, her borrowed white blouse far too large for her thin shoulders. Some students glanced at her with amusement, others with disdain. She lowered her eyes and kept walking. They gave her a small room in a dormitory, and a desk stacked with books. She could not read half of the symbols, but she traced them with her fingers as if they were carvings on stone. By day, she sat in lecture halls, where professors filled blackboards with lines of equations that curled across the surface like vines. The chalk squealed, and Clara listened not to the words but to the sound, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, as if the board itself was trying to breathe. At first, the professors were indulgent. They spoke of her as a curiosity. "A child with an unusual gift," they said, "something between folklore and talent." But after days of watching her spirals on the edges of notebooks and on the corners of boards, their patience began to wear thin. One morning, she was summoned. In a conference room, 5 professors sat behind a long table. Kerrigan was among them, though his face gave nothing away. On the blackboard was drawn one of her spirals, copied awkwardly by another hand. Professor Aldrich, a man with silver hair pressed flat against his head, spoke first. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "we appreciate your instinct. But if you wish to be taken seriously, you must abandon these drawings." He pointed sharply at the spiral. "This is not mathematics. It is decoration." Clara's hands tightened in her lap. "You must," Aldrich went on, "learn proper notation. You must use the symbols, the rules, the language of the system. Otherwise, no one will understand you. And if no one understands you, your work cannot belong here." Another professor leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "It is for your own sake, child. We want you to succeed. But you must stop drawing these spirals. They are distracting. They make you seem unserious." Clara lifted her eyes. They were quiet and steady, the same eyes that had watched the Arkansas soil crack under the sun. Her voice was soft, but unshaken. "If I stop drawing spirals," she said, "I stop thinking." The room stiffened. "That is childish nonsense," Aldrich replied, his tone sharp. Thinking requires discipline, not doodles. Kerrigan shifted slightly in his chair. He said nothing, but his gaze stayed on the spiral chalked on the board. Clara rose. The blouse hung loosely on her shoulders, her bare feet pressed against the polished floor as she walked to the blackboard. The professors watched, waiting for her to erase the spiral and yield. Instead, she picked up a piece of chalk. She traced her own spiral beside the one they had drawn, this one steady, clean, opening outward like a breath. Then, with the same chalk, she wrote in large, uneven letters, "If your system has no room for my way, I'll build one that does." She let the chalk fall. It struck the floor with a sharp crack. Without another word, Clara turned and walked out. Her footsteps were silent, but the absence she left behind thundered through the chamber. The professors sat frozen, their pride wounded, their authority unsettled. Some muttered about arrogance. Others stared at the spiral, unable to dismiss the strange certainty that it carried. Kerrigan remained still, his hands folded. His expression betrayed nothing. But inside, he felt the stirrings of something rare, respect mixed with unease. He had seen countless students bend and conform, never one who dared to leave such words behind. That night, in her small dorm room, Clara packed her things, a scrap of bread, a piece of charcoal, and a shawl folded neatly. She paused at the window, gazing at the city lights of Cambridge. To others, they looked like constellations. To her, they flickered, bright but hollow, burning without breath. She whispered to herself, "I will not silence the ground." And with that, Clara left the campus. The spirals would live again, not in lecture halls, but in soil and silence, where breath could not be erased. The bus left her at the edge of town, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and weeds. Clara stepped down barefoot, clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The air smelled of dust and laundry soap, faint, ghostly, from the shuttered laundromat at the corner. Its windows were cracked, its sign hanging loose by one chain, creaking in the wind. This was home again. Arkansas soil, dry and cracked, yet humming beneath her soles. She walked slowly through familiar streets, past the sagging porches and barking dogs, past the store where her mother once bought flour on credit. The town had not changed, or perhaps it had, and only Clara had shifted. She carried spirals now, not hidden in dirt but carved into her very breathing. At night, she lit a small fire in the yard behind the abandoned laundromat. The fire was modest, twigs, a few scraps of lumber, but its glow spilled onto the broken brick wall like a promise. Children noticed. They came first in pairs, curious and shy. Boys with dusty overalls, girls in faded dresses. They lingered in the shadows, watching the barefoot girl with her strange calm. Clara said nothing. She only drew spirals in the dirt with a stick, letting the firelight catch the curves. One evening, she set out a box of old chalk she had carried from Cambridge, pieces worn down to nubs. She broke them in half, placed them on the ground, and stepped back. The children hesitated, then crept forward. One picked up a fragment and scrawled a crooked circle. Another copied Clara's motion, curling it into a spiral. Laughter bubbled, soft and uncertain, as the chalk squeaked. Clara watched. She did not correct. She did not teach in the way teachers did. She simply drew her own spiral, slow and steady, and let them follow. Word spread. By the week's end, a dozen children gathered in the laundromat yard, their bare knees smudged with dust, their small hands covered in chalk. They filled the broken pavement with spirals, some neat, some wild, some that looped back on themselves. The yard became a galaxy of breathing shapes. Clara called it nothing, but the town whispered, the spiral school. It had no desks, no tests, no grades. There was only chalk and earth, laughter and silence. Children who had never cared for numbers began to linger by the yard, tracing arcs in the air with their fingers even after the fire went out. Clara spoke little, but when she did, it was with images they understood. When rain hits one side of a roof, she told them, drawing lines of chalk that curved, it doesn't just fall down, it spreads, like sharing bread. The spiral makes sure no piece breaks alone. When a boy asked why fences leaned in storms, she sketched a spiral and answered, because the wind always wants to turn, and so must the wood. The children nodded, not needing equations. They felt the truth in their bones, as Clara did. One evening, as the fire cracked low, a new boy arrived. He was small, younger than the rest, with dark eyes that carried both hunger and stubborn light. His name was Eli Morales, an orphan. He said nothing at first, only crouched near the wall and watched. Clara placed a piece of chalk before him. He hesitated, then drew a line. Not a circle, not a neat spiral. Something different. His hand curved, paused, doubled back, then curved again, creating a ripple inside a spiral, like an echo. Clara leaned forward, breath catching. The firelight flickered over his chalk. The shape was strange, unpolished, but alive. It pulsed like a voice returning from the far end of a canyon, an echo spiral. The other children giggled at its oddity. But Clara touched the line gently. "Do you hear it?" she asked Eli. The boy frowned. "Hear what?" "The echo," Clara whispered. "It's new. It's yours." Eli's eyes widened. No one had ever told him something could belong to him. Not food, not a bed, not a future. But here, in chalk dust, he had made a sound only he could hear. The yard fell quiet. The fire cracked softly. Clara looked at the children and felt the breath of something larger than herself. The spirals were no longer hers. They were multiplying, reshaping, belonging to others. That night, as the embers faded, Clara sat alone against the laundromat wall. Her blouse smelled of smoke, her fingers white with chalk dust. She stared at Eli's echo spiral glowing faintly in the moonlight. A memory rose, the professors at MIT demanding she abandon spirals to adopt symbols she could not feel. She had walked away, and here, in the dirt of her town, she saw why. The spirals were not hers to translate into cold notation. They were alive, and they needed a place where no one would silence them. She closed her eyes and whispered, "If the system has no room, we will build one that does." The laundromat yard, with its broken walls and cracked pavement, had become a sanctuary. And in the silence after the fire, Clara knew a school had been born. Not a school of rules, but of breath. Not a school of lines, but of spirals. And in the smallest of the children, the orphan Eli, she saw a future that was not hers, but would carry forward what the world had almost buried. The laundromat yard glowed each evening with chalk dust and firelight. Spirals bloomed across the cracked pavement like constellations in a child's sky. Among them, Eli's echo spiral pulsed differently. A shape that seemed to ripple inward and outward at the same time, as if carrying memory. Clara had never seen anything like it. She told the boy so. And for the first time, Eli smiled. It was small, shy, but it lit the yard brighter than the flames. But far away, in offices with glass walls and polished floors, someone else had seen it too. Dr. Victor Lang, the man who had once stolen Clara's spirals and dressed them as his own, came across a photograph. A visitor to the yard had taken it. Chalk spirals glowing under firelight, children kneeling in dust. Lang's eyes fixed on the unfamiliar one, the echo spiral. It was not Clara's hand. It was something new, something he could use. Within weeks, an article appeared in a respected journal. Its title was grand, its diagrams clean, its words precise. At the heart of it was Eli's spiral, renamed, repackaged, claimed as Lang's resonant feedback curve. Clara read it by chance, the pages passed to her by Mr. Browder, whose hands shook as he held the journal. "They've taken it, Clara," he said, voice raw. "They've stolen the boy's gift." Eli sat beside her, his knees pulled to his chest. He stared at the pictures of his spiral, printed in neat black lines. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Finally, he whispered, "But I didn't write it. I only drew it." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She pulled him close. "That's why it's real," she said softly. "Because you drew it without wanting to own it." But Eli's face crumpled. "Now, it belongs to him." "No," Clara said firmly, though her throat burned. "It belongs to the truth." "And the truth is louder than his lies." The town buzzed with anger. Children gathered in the yard, chalk clutched in their fists as if ready for battle. They didn't understand journals or academic theft, but they knew someone had tried to erase one of their own. Clara built a fire higher than usual that night. Its sparks leapt into the dark sky. She turned to Eli, pressing a piece of chalk into his hand. "Draw it," she said. Eli shook his head. "They'll just take it again." "Then let them," Clara whispered. "Because when you draw it here, in front of everyone, they can't say it isn't yours. Not ever again." The children circled close. Some neighbors leaned on fences, curious. The fire crackled, and the yard held its breath. Eli knelt, trembling. He placed the chalk on the ground. Slowly, he began. A curve outward, a pause. A ripple inward, another outward swell. His hand shook, but Clara laid her palm gently on his back, steadying him. The spiral grew, imperfect, alive, breathing. When he finished, Eli looked up at the gathered faces. "It came to me," he said haltingly, "like a sound you hear twice. Once when you speak, and again when it comes back. I didn't mean for it, I just listened." A silence deeper than any Clara had known fell over the yard. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. And then, applause. Not the polite tapping of academic halls, but the raw sound of children clapping, neighbors shouting, hands striking together with joy. The sound rolled like thunder across the dusty street. Someone had recorded it, on a phone, shaky and grainy. By morning, the video was flying across the world. Millions watched a barefoot boy in Arkansas kneel by a fire and draw an echo spiral in chalk, his voice breaking as he explained, "It was like a sound you hear twice." It reached scientists in labs, engineers in offices, and old men sitting at kitchen tables who once built barns by hand. Many wept without knowing why. For Victor Lang, it was humiliation. His polished article now seemed hollow beside the trembling truth of a boy's chalk and fire. He tried to claim it again, to dismiss the video as staged, but the world had already chosen which version to believe. That night, Clara sat beside Eli, the fire low and quiet. He leaned against her, still stunned by the storm his spiral had stirred. "You see," she murmured, "the world cannot ignore what is real. They can steal paper, but they cannot steal breath." Eli's eyes were heavy, his head resting on her shoulder. "Do you think they'll still remember me tomorrow?" Clara looked at the faint glow of his spiral under the ashes of chalk dust. "Yes," she whispered, "because tomorrow you will draw it again, and the day after, and as long as the ground listens, it will never forget you." The fire hissed, settling into embers, and in the quiet yard, Clara understood. The wave of opposition had come, fierce and cruel, but it had broken not against her, against the small hand of a boy who had drawn a sound into the earth. Snow fell lightly over Geneva, dusting the lake with silver. Clara had never seen snow before. She stood by the glass of the great conference hall, her bare feet tucked beneath her shawl, watching the flakes drift down like chalk dust from the sky. Eli pressed his nose to the window beside her. His breath left little circles of fog. "It's like the spirals," he said. "Falling, turning, never landing the same way twice." Inside, the hall prepared for them. Rows of scholars, diplomats, engineers, and journalists filled the seats. The air was sharp with anticipation, the kind that usually preceded complex diagrams, laser pointers, and long speeches about progress. But tonight, there would be none of that. Clara felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. She whispered to Eli, "We don't need to prove anything. We just need to let them hear." When their names were called, they walked slowly to the stage. The lights were bright, the silence vast. Eli's hand trembled in hers, but Clara squeezed it, steadying him. A blackboard had been placed at the center. Chalk waited in a tray, pale against the dark slate. No formulas filled it. It was empty, patient, ready. The moderator introduced them with careful words. Miss Clara Whitfield, age 14, and Master Eli Morales, age 12, from Arkansas, United States, presenting an alternative vision of structural resonance. His tone faltered on the last phrase, as if he could not decide whether to mock or marvel. Clara stepped forward. She did not bow, did not thank them. She picked up the chalk. Her hand moved slowly, tracing a spiral, wide at first, then narrowing, then widening again, like breath itself. She spoke, her voice soft but carrying. "The earth doesn't fall in lines. It falls in turns so it can rise again." She drew another, this one smaller, rippling inside the first. "When the wind comes, structures don't only move up and down. They twist. They hum. You don't always see it, but you can hear it, if you listen." Then she stepped back. Eli came forward. His knees shook, but he lifted the chalk as if it were a torch. He drew his echo spiral, the ripple within the ripple, imperfect but alive. His voice cracked, but he spoke anyway. "This came to me when I was quiet, like a sound you hear twice, first when you speak, and again when it comes back. I didn't plan it. I only listened." The hall was silent. Clara laid a hand on his shoulder. Together they stepped away from the board. The spirals glowed white against black, breathing without words. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, an old man in the front row, a professor with hands spotted by age, rose to his feet. His eyes shone wet as he said, "When I was young, I once watched my dog chase its tail. That circle led me to entropy. And tonight, your spiral has led me back to it. You have given me my youth again." His voice broke. He sat wiping his eyes. Others followed. One whispered, "This is modal resonance without numbers." Another murmured, "This is damping drawn as breath." But most simply sat in silence, not analyzing, only feeling. Cameras clicked. The world outside the hall watched through screens. Not a lecture, not a PowerPoint. Just two children, chalk-stained, barefoot, drawing spirals that breathed. Clara returned to the board one last time. She drew a spiral but left it open, the final curve unfinished, trailing outward like a path into air. She set the chalk down gently and turned to the hall. "Some ideas do not close," she said. "They breathe." The silence after her words was the loudest sound she had ever known. Then slowly applause began. Hesitant, reverent, swelling until it filled the hall, rolling like thunder softened by rain. Eli gripped her hand. His eyes were wide, his face pale with awe. "They listened," he whispered. Clara looked at the spirals glowing behind them. She did not smile, but her eyes softened. "Yes," she said. "For once, the world listened." And in that moment, in the heart of Geneva, it was not the scholars or the engineers who held the stage. It was two barefoot children carrying the breath of soil and silence into the grand halls of the world. Years passed. The laundromat yard remained the same: cracked pavement, broken brick, weeds growing stubborn through the gaps. But children kept coming. At first from town, then from neighboring counties, and then from far beyond. They came with bare feet, worn shoes, sometimes with nothing at all but the hope of being seen. They called it Spiral School. It had no roof, no exams, no degrees. Its only tools were chalk, dirt, and the silence Clara demanded at the beginning of every gathering. "Listen first," she told them, "then draw." The spirals multiplied. Some children traced them wide and wild. Others folded them tight, as if hiding secrets in each loop. The yard became a living library written not in books, but in dust. Clara grew older. Her hair, once the color of earth, turned silver like the chalk itself. Her shoulders bent, her steps slowed, yet her hands never forgot the motion of the spiral. Eli grew too, taller, stronger, but still carrying the same dark eyes that had first drawn the echo spiral into dirt. He taught beside her, guiding small hands, telling stories of the night when the world had listened in Geneva. Children looked at him as if he carried fire in his palms. Sometimes visitors arrived, professors, journalists, strangers with cameras. They marveled at the cracked yard filled with children who learned without books. They asked for definitions, for formulas, for a system. Clara only shook her head. "The spiral is the system," she said. "It is enough." One winter evening, Clara sat by the wall of the laundromat, watching the last embers of a fire glow. The children had gone, their laughter fading into the night. Eli sat beside her, quiet. She spoke softly. "Do you remember the first time you drew the echo spiral?" He nodded. "I was afraid. I thought it was wrong. And now?" Eli looked at the chalk dust covering his hands. "Now I know wrong is sometimes the doorway to new." Clara smiled faintly. The lines of her face deepened, but her eyes held the same still gravity as when she was a child in Arkansas clay. "Then it's time, Eli. This place belongs to you now." He turned sharply. "No, it's yours." She shook her head. "It was never mine. I only listened first. But the spiral keeps moving. It must pass through other hands." That night, she slept in her small shack, the roof patched with tin, the floor still etched faintly with spirals she had drawn decades earlier. Her mother's quilt lay folded by her bed, worn thin but whole. Clara dreamed of bridges that breathed evenly, of children tracing spirals in sand, snow, and ash. Morning came soft and golden. Clara rose slowly, chalk between her fingers. She walked to the laundromat wall, rough and crumbling. She drew one last spiral, wide, steady, but left it open, trailing into air. She set the chalk on the ground and whispered, Some ideas do not close. They breathe. She did not draw again. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the laundromat yard, carried from across the ocean. It was from a girl in Mongolia. Inside was a photograph. A spiral drawn with a stick in the desert sand, curling outward under a vast sky. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, the girl had written, "I don't know your name, but I found this shape when I was alone. It helps me breathe." Eli read the letter aloud to the gathered children. They sat in silence, the photograph passing from hand to hand. Clara, frail now, sat at the back. She listened. A slow smile spread across her face. "You see," she whispered, "it was never ours." It belongs to those the world forgets. That evening, the children drew spirals across the entire yard until no pavement showed. They lit fires in each corner, their light weaving together like a great breathing chest. Eli stood before them, not as a boy anymore, but as the next keeper of the breath. And Clara, watching the glow, felt no fear. The spirals were safe. When night deepened, she rose once more, tracing the wall where her last spiral waited unfinished. She placed her palm over it, as if sealing it not with chalk, but with her heartbeat. Then she turned away, leaving the chalk where it lay. The spiral school carried on, not because of a barefoot girl who once whispered about bridges, but because children in forgotten places kept drawing, listening, and breathing through the lines they made. And though the world would write her name in journals and stories, Clara June Whitfield knew the truth as she walked into her last years. The spiral was never hers. It belonged to silence. It belonged to the ground. It belonged to the forgotten, who would draw it again and again until the end of time. Thank you, my friends, for staying with Clara's journey all the way to the end. If these spirals, these small breaths of hope, touched something in you, I'd be honored if you stayed with us for the stories yet to come. You can subscribe here, not as a button to press, but as a seat by the fire waiting for you. Until next time, may your days be gentle and your nights be at peace.